These people all believe in some kind of engagement through all these multilateral agencies that are part of this hydra-headed monster, the chief head of which, of course, is the United Nations. They all believe in being involved in all these entangling alliances and all these entangling multilateral entities. They all believe in foreign aid. They all believe in a huge interventionist role for the government in the domestic economy. I mean, even this otherwise estimable and very appealing man, Tom Coburn, the Republican senator from Oklahoma, who gave that stirring speech a couple of days ago condemning the so-called stimulus package, when you pin him to the wall and you put him under the blaring lights of media publicity, and he was put on CNN a couple of days ago in a clip that I watched this afternoon, and he had flung in his face all of the potted talking points and all the prefabricated pseudo-arguments on behalf of the stimulus program. To wit, you're just saying that we should do nothing while the economy collapses, people are being thrown out of work, we have to start spending now, we have no alternative to doing this. You know, all these things that basically tell us to take counsel of our fears and to suspend rational discourse. You put him in that environment, he starts talking about the idea of alternative forms of federal spending. Well, rather than spending on this, we should be spending on that. Rather than spending on make-work programs for Democratic Party welfare state constituencies, we need to be spending on infrastructure in this country. That's one of the things he said specifically. Well, the truth is we do need to spend on infrastructure in this country, but that's not something government should be doing. We should be getting government out of these roles, freeing up the capital by reducing the size and expense of government, and letting the private sector provide the infrastructure, because if we did, the infrastructure would work, it would endure, it would last. If we were to free up the capital that Mr. Obama plans to spend slopping the troughs of his preferred constituencies, and free up the capital that is being literally burned up overseas in two counterproductive and useless wars, and being burned up in unconstitutional foreign aid, and in the maintenance of a globe-straddling empire, if we were to stop wasting our capital on these expenditures and these ventures in futility, we would be able to bring about a renaissance of the private sector here in the United States. It would take a few years. Admittedly, we'd still go through a recession. We've been living beyond our means for many, many years, and there are prices that have to be paid. There are settlements that have to be reached. There are accounts that have to be settled. That would incur some pain. Pain is not something we like, but sometimes pain is nature's way of repairing the damage that has been done. But if we were to take the course I'm describing right now, that of radically reducing the size of government and restoring sound money to the economy, we'd be able to turn everything around in a matter of maybe 3, 5, or 7 years. As it's happening right now, they're literally destroying the economy. We're heading the way of Zimbabwe in terms of the inflation profile of our central bank and its appurtenances and affiliates. And so they're talking about bringing about unprecedented economic and financial catastrophe, and they're panicking people into supporting this. I think that if you take a core sample of the headlines and editorials being put out by the familiar organs of mass deception, the New York Times, Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the evening newscasts, all of them are saying basically the same thing. We have to have this spending because the only way that we get out of an economic downturn is for government to take an ever bigger role in the economy, start pumping out money, or what they call liquidity by way of a useful euphemism, so as to preserve us from further economic destruction, job loss, and horrors of that kind. This is something else that Obama said in that speech in Williamsburg when he expressed some puzzlement over the fact that people were criticizing the so-called stimulus package by saying it was merely a huge spending program. And what he said by way of a reaction to that was, quote, "What do you think stimulus is? That's the point." In other words, the only way, from Obama's perspective, that you can actually stimulate economic growth is for the government to steal wealth from the productive and then redirect it as it sees fit based on political metrics rather than on market signals. This is a perfect illustration of the fact that Mr. Obama, despite his charming and urbane veneer, despite the fact that he has a certain self-possession about him that I find quite appealing, that appeals to young people in particular, he seems like a likable enough guy. He's got a beautiful family. But, folks, he's a Marxist down to his chromosomes. He cannot conceptualize the world in any way that doesn't involve central planning, massive government intervention, and government supervision of the entire economy. It just makes no sense to him. From his perspective, economic growth is something that government provides, something that government produces, and that those of us who have aspirations to operate in the private sector, whatever goes on in the private sector beyond government control, that goes on basically by the forbearance of government. It's by the grace of the state that there's any private investment, any private enterprise in this country, because what really works from Obama's perspective is government intervention.
I think it's really what the average American doesn't understand is this idea that they have said there are certain banks that are too large to fail, so we've got, of course, to bail them out. What they do never talk about, Bank of America and Wells Fargo, both of these banks are insolvent, two of our largest banks that are too large to fail. But together, those two banks have, between credit default swaps and derivatives, about $70 trillion of liabilities, $70 trillion. Now, remember that the budget of the United States is a little over $3 trillion. The entire capitalization of the entire stock market is about $12 trillion. If we take everything in this country, it's probably worth $30 trillion, $30 or $40 trillion. And yet they have put us said, well, we're going to just go ahead and guarantee these banks. We're taking on an additional debt of somewhere in the neighborhood of $60 trillion. Now, where's the money going to come from? Well, government doesn't have any money. It has to either tax the people. Well, you can't tax the people. They wouldn't stand for, having to give everything they earn to the government over a period of the next 20 years, because that's the only way you could come up with that amount of money. And then, of course, they can always borrow it, but who's going to lend money to a country, to a government that has that sort of debt? Would you? And a third alternative is to simply print the money and pay the debts off that way. But when you print the money, you destroy the value of the existing money. And when William talks about the fact we're headed the way of Zimbabwe, that's exactly where they are. They just issued a new $50 trillion note. Maybe soon it'll be a $500 trillion note. It really doesn't have any relevance. What they have done, they've decided to do, and they're not telling the American people, is to destroy the value of our currency, to destroy the infrastructure of this nation. And at that point, we will have no alternative other than the New World Order, which is what this is really about. We're going to be back in just a moment with our special guest, Mr. William Grigg. All right, William, go right ahead.
It's interesting that you bring up Zimbabwe, and we talk about Zimbabwe practically every time I'm on the program for very good reason. And once again, I have to reiterate my hunch, and it's a hunch, but it's a hunch that's rooted in an appreciation of the personality and the inclinations of this ruling elite that we're dealing with. However you want to characterize them, if you want to talk about them as the power elite, which is my preferred description in large measure, because I don't see how you can deny that there is a global power elite. We see them operate in open, although most of what is really important things that are done by the power elite is done behind closed doors and beyond the scrutiny of television cameras and inquisitive microphones. You want to call them the power elite, you want to call them the insiders, if you want to call them what you will, the ruling oligarchy. If you understand their inclinations, their objectives, my hunch about Zimbabwe, I think, makes sense, and that is that they're using Zimbabwe as sort of a controlled experiment in economic and socio-political chaos, because never before in the history of mankind, at least that I'm aware of, has hyperinflation been allowed to run as rampantly as it has in Zimbabwe. And there was a piece just a couple of days ago that I found very arresting. It talked about Patrick Chinamasa, who is the finance minister in Zimbabwe. Actually, forgive me, it was Gideon Gono. He's the governor of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. Gideon Gono is the equivalent of their Federal Reserve Bank. But they have arbitrarily slashed 12 zeros from their currency.